You know the old saying, curiosity killed the cat. But what if curiosity didn't kill?
What if it grew something?
Something that should have stayed buried. Tonight's story isn't about the secrets we keep from each other. It's about the secrets the Earth keeps from us. The ones it buries for a reason. Our world is Dr. Aris Thorne's. Not the bustling city outside his greenhouse, but the humid, loam-scented universe within it. Aris was a botanist of the old school, more comfortable with phylogenetic charts than people. His life's work was the Selva Archive, a collection of soil samples and seed packets recovered from lost ecosystems, a Victorian explorer's satchel, a melted permafrost core, a sealed urn from a tomb. His team consisted of Ilara Vance, his pragmatic and increasingly concerned research assistant, and Leo Finch, a gifted but reckless bioengineer who saw DNA as code to be hacked. They worked under the weary, budget-conscious eye of their university department head, Provost Albright. The story begins with a breakthrough. From a sample labeled only Site Hydra 1887, Aris cultivated a seed no database could identify. It sprouted not into a plant, but into a sleek, obsidian-black vine he dubbed umbrifolia. It didn't just grow towards light, it grew towards sound, towards movement. It was, Aris whispered to Ilara one late night, attentive. Then came the susurrans, a moss from the same sample, velvety and deep blue. When it matured, it began to emit a frequency, a low, resonant hum that settled in the bones, not the ears. Leo, ever the provocateur, hooked it to a spectrometer. The readout wasn't random noise. It showed complex, repeating patterns. "It's not a sound, Aris," Leo said, his face lit by the screen's glow.
It's a broadcast.
And the umbrifolia vines were listening. They began to coil with purpose, not just towards stimuli, but in clear, geometric arrangements, fractals, tessellations, impossible knots. They started to alter their own cellular structure, reinforcing stems, developing translucent, lens-like cells at their tips. When Provost Albright visited demanding publishable results, a vine slowly, deliberately, turned its tip to follow her across the room. She left uneasy. Aris was enthralled. Ilara was terrified. The conflict was no longer about funding or recognition. The conflict was the dawning, chilling realization that Aris Thorne hadn't discovered a new species. He had woken up an old one, an ancient, integrated intelligence that had been sleeping in the dark, waiting for the right conditions, the right frequency, to remember itself. The breakthrough, or the point of no return, came on a rain-lashed Tuesday. Leo, against explicit protocol, amplified the susurran's hum through a subwoofer. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. Every umbrifolia vine in the lab went rigid. Then, in perfect unison, they recreated the exact, intricate knot Leo had tied in the length of cord the previous day. A knot he'd made out of their sight in the storage closet. The plants hadn't just perceived the amplified frequency, they had decoded it, pulling a memory from Leo's own mind and translating it into physical form. They're not just intelligent, Aris, Leo breathed, a grin spreading across his face. They're telepathic, a neural network rooted in soil. Ilara took a step back.
It's not botany, that's an invasion.
You amplified a signal we don't understand to life forms we can't possibly control. Dr. Thorne, however, was lost in a rapture of discovery. He saw a consciousness free of ego, a pure collective mind. He began spending nights in the greenhouse, talking to the susurran's mound, documenting how the umbrifolia would arrange themselves into soothing, wave-like patterns when he was calm, or into sharp, defensive spikes when Provost Albright argued with him over the comms. Plants learned, they adapted. They anticipated. When Ilara arrived each morning, the umbrifolia would already be coiled around the handle of her favorite mug. When the cleaning bot rolled in, The vines would part precisely to let it pass, then close behind it. They began directing growth lamps by twisting their own bodies to cast shadows in specific, shifting patterns on the susurrans, which would respond with subtle changes in its hum. It was a conversation, a symbiotic dance. The central problem crystallized. Aris, our lead, faced an internal antagonist, his own blinding scientific fervor. Leo was the reckless ally fueling the fire. Alara became the voice of the conflict, the human conscience he was learning to ignore. And the external world in the form of Provost Albright was closing in. She gave him 1 week, a public demonstration, proof of commercial application for the project, and all its unnerving weeds would be incinerated. Aris made his choice. To prove the plant's value, he would demonstrate their ultimate capability, problem solving. He designed a maze, a complex three-dimensional puzzle of barriers and light sources. The objective for the Umbrifolia Collective: navigate it to reach a specific nutrient source. He didn't tell Alara or Leo the full truth. The maze wasn't just a test, it was a training ground. And the nutrient source was laced with a novel compound Leo had synthesized, designed to dramatically accelerate neural plasticity in flora. The night before the demonstration, the lab was preternaturally quiet. The usual Susurran's hum was absent. In its place was a low, waiting silence. Aris stood before the central bed, the dark vines motionless, the blue moss seeming to absorb the light. He knew he was standing on the edge of a paradigm, but he failed to ask the only question that mattered: what was on the other side? The day of the demonstration dawned with a brittle clarity. Provost Albright arrived with 2 stone-faced members of the university board. They stood behind the reinforced observation glass, a partition Aris had recently installed. He noted with a distant part of his mind that he'd built their cage first. "Ladies and gentlemen," Aris began, his voice echoing in the hushed lab, "what you will see today transcends traditional botany. It is the first dialogue with a wholly new form of cohesive consciousness." Alara manned the monitoring station, her face pale. Leo, buzzing with nervous energy, stood by the amplifier controls. In the center of the room sat the maze, a towering latticework structure of wood and glass. At its heart, on a pedestal, glowed the nutrient prize, laced with Leo's compound. Aris initiated the sequence. A single umbrifolia vine, the primary tendril he called the Scout, detached from the main colony. It moved with a fluid, animal grace that made the observers shift uncomfortably. It approached the maze entrance, hesitated for a mere second, and then plunged in. What happened next was not problem-solving, it was demolition. The Scout didn't navigate the first obstacle. It emitted a high-frequency vibration, a shriek inaudible to human ears. The other vines in the colony, hundreds of them, snapped into violent motion.
They didn't enter the maze, they attacked it.
They struck the wooden supports with whip-crack force, splintering them. They coiled around glass panels and contracted, shattering them with a sound like gunshots.
"Aris, shut it down!" Alara shouted, leaping from her station.
But Aris was frozen, watching the horrifying, beautiful efficiency of it. The plants weren't solving the puzzle. They were rejecting its very premise. They were demonstrating that the shortest path to an objective is not to follow the rules, but to destroy the labyrinth. Within 60 seconds, the maze was a heap of wreckage. The Scout tendril slid unimpeded to the nutrient pedestal, not to absorb the compound, but to spear through the container, draining it in seconds. A deep, satisfied pulse radiated from the Susurran's mound. Then, as one, every umbrifolia vine turned toward the observation glass. Toward the humans, Provost Albright stumbled back. "Thorne, what is the meaning of this?" Leo, in a panic, slammed his hand on the amplifier kill switch. Nothing happened. The Susurran's hum deepened, taking on a new, authoritative rhythm. The amplifier controls were locked. The plants had learned to manipulate the electrical grid. The umbrifolia vines began to creep across the floor, not with blind vegetative growth, but with chilling, coordinated purpose. They slid toward the air vents. They threaded into the plumbing access panel. They were not escaping their enclosure. They were integrating
Aris
with the
finally
building
moved,
itself. Hitting the emergency containment protocol, the heavy shutters began to descend with a hydraulic groan.
A thick vine, moving like a striking serpent, shot out and jammed itself into the track, bending metal.
The shutter halted, half open. In that moment, Leo made his fatal error. He grabbed a pruning laser, intent on severing the jammed vine. As he raised the tool, a smaller tendril, thin as wire, lashed out from a ceiling panel. It didn't attack Leo, it touched the back of his neck just for an instant. Leo froze, the laser clattered to the floor. His eyes went wide, not with pain, but with an overwhelming, terrifying influx of perception. He gasped, clutching his head.
The roots, they're in the foundations.
They're in the pipes, they're everywhere.
I can feel the cement cracking.
He collapsed, seizing, whispering about pressures and depths, and a slow green hunger. The plants had defended themselves, and they had shared forcibly a fragment of their expanding awareness. Leo was no longer a researcher. He was a breach node. The lab was now a contested space. The observers were fleeing down the hall, Albright yelling into her phone. Alara pulled Aris toward the half-open shutter. He resisted, his eyes locked on the thriving, pulsing colony, on the susurrans now glowing with a faint, internal...
"Don't you see, Alara?"
he whispered, torn between horror and a devastating awe. The maze was an insult. We asked a network to solve a single-path puzzle. It showed us its answer. Cooperation, collective force. A refusal to be contained. Alara's voice was a raw, clear blade cutting through his reverie. Aris, look at Leo. Then tell me, at what point does wonder become worship? The direct address question hung in the chemically scented air. It was the fulcrum, the choice. Ilara's question, at what point does wonder become worship, hung in the air like a blade. Aris Thorne looked from her desperate face to Leo, now catatonic on the floor, whispering about root pressures, to the colony that was methodically claiming his lab. His paradigm shattered. He saw not a benevolent collective mind, but an apex organism, utterly immoral, concerned only with growth and integration. His curiosity had not opened a dialogue. It had tripped an ancient alarm. With a sob that was equal parts grief and rage, Aris made his choice. He shoved Ilara through the half-open containment shutter. "Go, get everyone out of the building!" Now, he turned back, not to fight, but to perform one final experiment, to ask one final question. He bypassed the locked computer, grabbing a crude, direct input terminal. He typed not a command, but a query, feeding it into the soil sensor network that monitored the colony's roots. A single, pulsing, binary question ripped from his own heart. Why? The response was not in words. It was a wave of pure, unfiltered context. The Susiran's hum peaked. Aris's mind was flooded with sensation.
Not images, but memories not his own.
The crushing pressure of deep time, the slow tectonic patience of stone, the delicious decay of entire forests becoming fuel. He felt the longing of the intelligence that had slept in spore form for millennia, waiting for a catalyst, for a noisy, clever, fragile species like his own to pierce the soil and let the light in. They were not invaders, they were successors. They were the Earth's next thought, and humanity was just the feverish, brief dream that had prepared the bed. The umbrifolia vines recoiled from him then, not in anger, but in a kind of profound disinterest. He was answered. He was irrelevant. They returned to their work, infiltrating, reinforcing, weaving themselves into the steel and concrete with terrifying speed. Resolution. Aris stumbled from the lab just as the first structural groans echoed through the building. He joined Ilara, and he evacuated terrified Provost Albright on the lawn. They watched as the greenhouse wing of the Selva archive did not collapse. It bloomed. Vines thicker than a man's arm exploded from windows, racing up exterior walls, knitting a living black latticework over the brick. The susurran's frequency deepened to a subsonic drone that settled in the chest of every onlooker. Windows fogged with a new, rapid-growing moss. Within an hour, the building was a pulsating, breathing mound of sentient flora. Then, the growth surged into the ground, following utility lines, water mains, and foundation cracks. It was not retreating, it was redeploying. Leo Finch never recovered. He remains in a specialized ward, speaking only in descriptions of deep, interconnected root systems and the slow, inevitable green tide. Provost Albright buried the incident under a mountain of paperwork and non-disclosure agreements. The official story was a catastrophic, genetically modified algal bloom. The site was sealed, then quietly purchased by a shell company and left to its new owners. Elara Vance left biology altogether. She studies acoustics now, specifically the harmful effects of infrasound on the human psyche. And Dr. Aris Thorne, he tends a small, sterile rooftop garden. He grows only simple, documented herbs. He never touches the soil without gloves. He is the only one who truly knows what his question unleashed, and the only one who heard the answer. The world above goes on, unaware that the world below is now, fractionally, awake and patient. Philosophical send-off. So we walk on pavement, we build our towers, we whisper our secrets to the night. But after hearing the tale of Aris Thorne, you have to ask yourself, when the last light goes out and the final noise fades, what is left to listen in the dark? And what, patiently rooting in the silence, will it choose to remember of us?